Hello, I'm Joanna North. I'm a psychotherapist and psychologist. Welcome to my Mindkind podcast.
So this is Jo North. I'm working with my friend and colleague Sheetal Amin, and both Sheetal and I work in mental health, working with children and families. And we've been talking a lot about ways to help children. In our last podcast, we talked about how racism and discrimination affects a child's mental health and ways that you can inoculate your child against that. And this week, we just wanted to talk about more of our understanding of ways to help parents and the kind of difficulties that arise. So already we've been talking about ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. And so I think it's really important for people to know about what these might look like, Sheetal, and I just wondered how you would explain that to people.
Thank you very much, Jo. It's nice to have this conversation again. I was just reflecting that this week is Mental Health Awareness Week, so I think it's quite timely that we're having this conversation, really.
Yeah.
You know, what it means to parents when they've got kids who are suffering. And, you know, we've got some really complex environmental factors going on at the moment, haven't we, Jo, in terms of COVID and the impact of that on families, on parents, on kids, adolescents who all of their life is about social communication and social networking and having to kind of remain at home, working from home, not being able to see their friends. And it's just been huge.
It's a good, thanks for the reminder, because we can't escape the environment that we're living in, and we are all affected by that on some kind of unconscious level. And people are now trying to describe the ways they've been affected. So I think you're absolutely right. And I think one of the kind of really basic premises of a lot of our conversations is that what is in the mind of a parent will also be in the mind of a child, that what a parent is going through, a child will see and experience too. And I think that one of the things that we try to do all the time in our work and in our fields is help adults that care for children to understand that. So I think that, thanks for the reminder of that. It's really important. How's it been affecting you?
Gosh, how's it been affecting me? I think, you know, as an adult, just reflecting on home working and both sides of it, sort of not being in touch with people face to face and the absence of that, but prolonged sort of working from home and becoming very comfortable with that. And then the anxiety that's there in terms of suddenly going back out in the community and what that means. So it's a really kind of confusing experience for me, really, in terms of the work I'm doing. And it's got me to think about how it is for our young people. And when we're talking about adverse childhood experiences, this is an adverse experience that's there for all of us. You know, COVID can be classed as an adverse childhood experience, you know, and that's had, over the last year and a half, 2 years, has had an instrumental impact on all of us. You know, children, young people, they've been affected by not going into school. Children, young people who were doing GCSEs, A-levels, it's been impacted in terms of how they sit those exams and meet those milestones. Young people who start university, you know, the whole thing about initiations into new beginnings, like the Freshers' Week, and, you know, when everything's virtual last year, a lot of kind of those milestones and experiences of those journeys have been missed out for so many.
Yeah. And it's a lot of loss, isn't it? I know that obviously literal loss in that people are dying, but loss of experience that you can't control. And I think also it brings up for people a fear of death. I think children understand that the big deal going on here is there's something going on that could kill people. I don't think children miss that.
No.
And I think that at some level, they're all deeply affected by that, as well as what they've missed out on.
Yeah. I think it kind of, you know, it challenges children's narrative. If you look at a lot of the storybooks and stories we tell children, which is about this cycle of life, which is that you're born, you live a life, and you die mostly when you get old. Sort of to suddenly be in this experience whereby death, or how fragile life is, has not just got to do with the circle of life of that, you're born, then you live life and you get old, but it's about diseases. And suddenly that coming into their reality, they will know people who are nowhere near ready in their life to pass away, but yet COVID has taken them. And in a very short time frame. And how do children make sense of that kind of loss? How do children make sense of something such as this pandemic that suddenly has this global impact to such a level, and all the other elements that go with it in terms of having to go through lockdown, not seeing people? There's so much to learn from other cultures in terms of how we manage loss, in terms of a shared communal grieving. And there's been so much written about the impact of nuclear grieving, the solitary grieving that we can get into, and how that can have such a detrimental impact on our mental health in terms of depression, anxiety. And here we are, that this situation has almost created a solitary nuclear grief reaction. You can't grieve with people, people can't comfort you, can't visit you, you can't even see the people you've lost, or you can't have the ending you want with that loved one in the way that you even thought about people being buried or cremated. Because these are bodies that have still got elements of the disease within them, in the bones. It's tragic. How do children make sense of all of that?
Do you think it's going to traumatise children? Are you going to see children who are traumatised? Is this coming back to adverse childhood experiences? Are we counting this kind of trauma in there? What are you thinking about that?
It wouldn't surprise me. From the work within mental health services, what I see is the children who are anxious to start with. What this has done is really made them fear any kind of contamination. So it's absolutely heightened their anxiety around contamination, around disease, because they don't want to catch the disease. Not only that, the anxiety around their family members, parents, grandparents, suddenly having to go outside of the house or go into the community, and the impact that's having on these children. The children are becoming very solitary. They don't want to go outside of the house.
Yes.
So I worry about the impact on children in terms of, the ones who've lost people very quickly. Some have not lost people, but also still feel the fear of losing somebody that they love. The issues around abandonment and loss are huge for children. There's suddenly their security blanket being pulled from under them without any control. And that's what this has done, is there hasn't been a process, or it's the lack of control.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think also, that it's different in different groups? And this is a global experience, isn't it? And there's this terrible thing whereby poverty makes this worse. That children who come from poorer households are likely to be more deeply affected educationally, and more likely to miss out on their learning, and all of those things. So all of that adversity gets compounded and becomes worse. And then they're having now to come back into school, and then there's going to be this disparity. So for some children, they've had a lot more support. For others, they haven't had so much support. And I think it's just as when we're talking about adverse childhood experiences, I think lack of support is an adverse childhood experience. Would that be right in your view on ACEs, on adverse childhood experience, lack of, or sort of neglect and lack of support?
I guess, if you don't have that support, if you don't have a container around you, you cannot make sense of your childhood experiences which are outside of the norm. which is what adversity is about. You know, they were really challenging, they were complex. These experiences, a huge detrimental impact on your emotional regulation and how you're distressed, you know, how well you managed your feelings, how well you managed to understand that. And if you haven't got people trying to help you with that, then that becomes stuck, doesn't it? And then that's when it becomes an issue. When those kind of difficulties become stuck, then we get into mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. And you need someone to help you tell the story of what's been going on. And I guess that's where our job steps in. Is a lot, I'm sure it's the same for you, but a lot of our work is about helping people complete the story and make sense of the story of their life, whatever it is. I know that you work with looked after children, and so do I, and we've got a lot of common ground, because we know that children from ordinary families, you know, have a certain level of support, but looked after children have had those great big missing pieces in their lives. And I don't know about you, but when I'm helping children who are looked after by the state to tell their stories, it's always really hard for them, you know, because they're hard stories. It's like, it's not a fairy tale story. It's always, you know, well, somebody didn't look after me, or somebody left me, or somebody hurt me really badly, or I didn't get food, or I didn't get love, or I got traumatized, all of those things. I think we know that, is it 5 adverse experiences in your story are going to probably mean that you will struggle with your mental health unless you get some help with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's to give it some context, Jo, you know, these are, in terms of adverse childhood experiences, or the acronym ACEs, first came about in 1995. You know, those initial, so it was some time ago. It's not a new thing, but I think people are recognizing it more and more in terms of having a significance in terms of emotional distress and mental health. And I guess, you know, the first kind of studies that were carried out were in sort of in the United States at the Center for Disease and Prevention. And, you know, this study revealed the links between childhood experiences and mental health or physical health, you know. And it said about, it's not just during childhood, but it's lasting to the adulthood. So whatever those indicators were, they last into adulthood. And what it clearly illustrated, those very initial studies, is that childhood experience of trauma and stress in the home specifically, or the local environment, whilst growing up, raised a wide range of health issues for all of society. You know? And I think that's the bit, is the link between stress, trauma, and physical health. You know, they're not separate. You know, the stress and trauma and how the mind makes sense of that has an impact over time on how we function. Not just emotionally, not just in terms of our minds, but physically how we function. And I think more and more has now been linked to that. You know, there's been, you know, why is it that suddenly we talk about things like irritable bowel syndrome? You know, how much of that's stress related? A lot of kind of chronic fatigue syndromes, and also the element of stress, that if we're acutely stressed, then we know that there are certain physical illnesses which are really aggravated, and they get worse whilst our stress levels are worse.
Absolutely.
And there's a link between that. And I guess, you know, the kind of adverse experiences we're talking about when we think about stress and we think about trauma are things like, I mean, you know, you've got the most extremes, which is things like physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, you know, physical neglect, or emotional neglect. And as you know from working with looked after children, some of these are really, really hard to identify, especially the areas of emotional neglect. You know, and it's really, really hard to kind of try and come to terms with it and know what it is that we're talking about and identify. And then alongside that are elements such as, you know, addiction within the family, you know, parents who've got drug or alcohol addictions, you know, parents and mothers who are victims of domestic violence, in terms of what those children would have seen as babies, as they've grown up, but also what they've experienced in vitro when they were in the womb of their mums.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah, absolutely.
A family member being in jail, a family member diagnosed with mental illness, the disappearance of a parent through divorce, death, or abandonment. And that's exactly some of the things we're talking about here, is family members' impact if they've gone through death because of COVID, environmental factors, children coming or fleeing or experiencing war zone countries. Massive, massive childhood experiences. And it's the kind of pyramid ripple effect of that, Jet, which is that, you know, not only have you got, so if we take COVID as an example, not only have we got this pandemic, but then within that, everybody being under one roof raises those stress levels. Parents who've got young kids who are not at school, how do you homeschool young kids and also be required to work online from home? You know, so those stress levels are elevated, and the impact of that on how then they manage children.
Exactly.
Divorce rate has gone up.
Yeah.
In COVID.
Drinking and alcohol and things like that.
Alcohol intake, substance, all of this is on increase at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, you and I were just talking about cortisol, weren't we? Speaking of stress, we were talking about cortisol and the way that stress puts a chemical in our system of cortisol, which means that we're ready to fight or flight all the time, or ready to, things start to happen like flying off the handle, losing patience, you know, being angry, like showing an angry look on your face or having an aggressive voice. And all of these things have a very, very big impact on children. And I think that when we're giving parents advice, we really are thinking about lowering levels of cortisol. I mean, sometimes they're going to have to be there, but on the whole, lowering those levels and bringing in, how do we create dopamine? How do we create the wonderful soothing chemicals in the child's brain? And I expect you and I sit talking about that all day. And this sort of, I mean, you know, if you were going to have to go into a fight to save your child's life, well, you need some cortisol. But on the whole, we're not having to do that, you know, not in this country anyway. I mean, there are other parts of the world where I know that parents are having to live with those levels of cortisol for very real reasons. But even so, we can't live all the time with cortisol in our system without deeply affecting our central nervous systems and our brain and the way we think. We're going to be in constant overwhelm. And it's just going to be, I think if I were to describe being flooded with cortisol, it would be mental pain. It would just be that we would be in pain the whole time. And I'm just thinking, this week I've worked with a young person who really has spent the whole week in an agitated state and has been incredibly difficult to look after. And I've been saying, like, you know, we've got to just help this young person calm and soothe, because actually, although they're being really aggressive and really difficult, actually they are overwhelmed and they are in a lot of pain, and we've got to help with that. Is that familiar sort of world for you?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, cortisol, it's named as corrosive cortisol for a reason, Jet. You know, it's there, it comes from our mammalian brain. It's there as a fight, flight, fright response, as you said. You know, it's got a place because it makes us hypervigilant when we need to be. It's got a place in terms of helping us survive. It's our survival mechanism. However, when we have ACEs, if we can imagine, the cortisol is a stress chemical that our brain naturally produces. So each time there is any level of acute stress, it's flooding that frontal part of our brain, you know, and the frontal lobe is sort of our kind of superior brain. That's the computer that does all the memory, the thinking, the problem solving. And if it's constantly got this cortisol stress going into it and firing and releasing it, and it's never going back into the place where it belongs, in the mammalian, the reptilian brain, then what we've got is that we've got young people, we've got children who really struggle to problem solve. We have problems with memory, attention, focus. All of these areas are impacted, and we go into shutdown. The brain starts to go into a bit of a shutdown. Things like our sleep is affected, our appetite is affected, any kind of functioning is affected. Cortisol also has a huge impact on heart rate. And that's the whole thing about ACEs and the polyvagal system. These are kind of the relationship between the brain and the rest of our body, our muscles and what they're doing, our nerves and what they're doing.
Yeah, sure. So let's talk about, that's a really good description of what the heck. Our frontal lobes get hijacked, don't they? It's like being on a plane that's been hijacked, and we think we're going to sunny country, and suddenly the hijacker says, no, I'm taking you to the South Pole and it's going to be bad. So it's like that. But I'm thinking, I wonder if it's helpful if we describe ways, how do we soothe cortisol? How do we increase dopamine and relaxation? And we were going to think together about, how do we help? I'd really love to hear your favorite ways of soothing and calming, but mine is definitely to pay more attention to my breathing. It is really, if you look at all the neuroscience and you look at all of the advice on managing anxiety and stress, it really does lead to getting more attention on your breath. And that's not such an easy thing to do. If this was an easy thing to do, we would all have done it and we would be thinking about something else by now. But it's a really quite a tough thing to do. And so I spend a lot of time helping people to breathe. And the big buzzword now on breathing is that if you're stressed, if you breathe out for a little bit more than you breathe in, well, perhaps a few more counts out than in, then you're much more likely to connect with your body and with your breathing and with your heart. And I know that you were picking up on that, and you were talking about polyvagal theory. It sort of sounds ever so interesting. Tell us, what do you think about polyvagal theory?
Well, I guess when I'm talking about polyvagal systems and polyvagal theory, it's very much sort of it at the most basic levels. It's, I guess, understanding what happens. It's a polyvagal theory is the relationship between our visceral organs, so the sensory organs, how we feel, and the brain structure, okay? And the pathways that go between them, which are called, sensory nerves. And what tends to happen, because they send signals from organs informing the brainstem and helps to kind of regulate those organs again. So if we've got this level of stress chemical in our brain, it shuts that kind of system down, increases heart rate, or in some place, if we're going into a complete shutdown, it slows it right down. Now, when we have some of these kind of relationships between the brain and the nervous system going on, what tends to happen is long term, it's having an impact. And there's been evidence of, heart disease and heart problems, diabetes, cholesterol, all of these elements are being linked with a prolonged kind of firing of cortisol, prolonged acute stress. And we flippantly say, don't we, Jo, like calm down or slow down, or you're going to give yourself a heart attack. But I think there is some kind of there's a level of truth in that.
Absolutely. And so I couldn't agree more. We sort of have these phrases in our language, don't, and we throw them around and we're not really listening to them. Because one of the recommendations for lowering cortisol is to slow down, is to literally, do things slowly and mindfully. And I think that, again, we've got these buzzwords for helping us out of stress and cortisol, mindfulness being one of them. And it gets bandied around, and it's written here and it's written there, and it's probably the front of our science right now in terms of managing mental health. But still, again, I would say if it was that easy, none of us would have these anxieties and none of us would have these mental health problems, because that brain goes on and on and on, thinking and thinking and thinking. And it just won't ever stop. The fact is, our brains are an organ and they will not stop thinking.
No.
What we have to do is try and get a little bit more friendly with it and in control of that and managing that. And so when I say, people say, well, you know, I've tried mindfulness, but I can't stop my thinking. And I feel so sad, because I think to myself, how did anyone get the idea that mindfulness was about stopping thinking? That's a real shame. We really know that if someone tells you not to think about something, the first thing you go and do is think about it.
Please don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss future episodes. And if you can rate the podcast in your podcast app, that will help spread the word and help more parents.
And so I just would like to define that a bit, because we're moving into how we help people now. We've talked about breathing and the polyvagal nerve and activating those systems so that we can calm people. But with mindfulness, all we're doing is being aware of the thoughts that consistently run through our mind, of just catching hold of them and noticing those thoughts, and not really trying to do anything about them, just being able to label them as they go through the mind. So, oh, there's my shopping list for today I've got to do. Oh, there's my worry about the bills that need paying. Oh, there's my stress because I've got to be at the school to pick up the children on time. And just keep to notice. And to notice is to be mindful. Notice what you're thinking. And our brains really can be incredibly over helpful. The mind loves to throw in its great ideas. And sometimes we need to just stop, and we need to slow down, and we need to notice those thoughts, and we need to get more into our breathing. And, you know, I think if we just did that for 10 minutes twice a day, well, I try really hard to do that. I am more sane for doing that. It's for sure. I mean, it doesn't make my life easier. It doesn't take all the difficulties away, but it definitely keeps me more sane.
I find it, you know, when I work with young people, Jo, I find it really helpful to think to them about the car. And I often ask them, you know, metaphorically, I'll say to them, well, you know, what happens if there's no petrol? You know, what happens to the car? And they'll often say, well, it stops working. And I said, exactly, it's a bit like that. But if you don't focus on your breath, and if you don't kind of slow yourself down, you're not making space in your brain. And I say the same about self-care to them. You know, if you don't fuel your brain, if you don't eat properly, which often goes, especially in adolescence, and I think for parents too, because especially when you've got younger children or when you're a busy parent, the first thing that goes is kind of your own routines and structures. You kind of pick at your food, you might have a sip of tea and put it down. So you're not being mindful about your self-care. If you don't fuel your brain and your body, it's not going to work to the level you want it to.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to kind of share, so, you know, we're talking about, well, what do we do? How do we kind of protect from the corrosiveness of cortisol? And I was thinking about these happy chemicals and how we hack them. You know, and I was thinking about dopamine, which is kind of our reward chemical. Oxytocin, you talk about the love hormone. We get that in abundance when we look at babies and we coo, and we naturally get this lovely feeling. It's, you know, it's there. Serotonin, the mood stabilizer, endorphins, which is the painkiller. You know, how do we actually stimulate? And how do we get children, and how as parents do we help kids release some of that? You know, so for example, when we're looking at dopamine, you know, the reward chemical, it's really important to complete tasks, you know, doing self-care activities, eating properly, celebrating the little wins. And I often talk with parents about having those little jars with little beads or something in it, and every time looking for the positives, not waiting until your child comes home with the reward or see, Mummy, I got a star today. But the smallest thing they do, it's like, wow, and really in awe, you know. So, wow, that's just amazing. Well done. You know what? I'm going to put a little bead in your jar or a little pasta shell in the jar for that today. Creating these kind of appraisal systems for your children is absolutely key, you know. What do we do in terms of how do we release some of that oxytocin? Playing with pets are brilliant for releasing it. Playing with for kids, for parents to play with your child, really, really important. Holding hands, it's that visceral again, the kind of senses. How do we activate that? You hold hands, you hugging your family, giving compliments. And how much of the oxytocin has been deprived through COVID, Jo, where we've not been able to have physical contact with
or touch, just stroking, stroking your head,
that limbic system.
Sure.
How do we regulate that? So to calm a baby, it's soothing a baby, and children need that too. Those strokes, and we've missed out on holding hands, being able to hug, all of that. And sort of how do we bring that back in as lockdown starts to lift a bit? And it's serotonin. What do we do about the mood stabilizers? How do we, and this is what we're talking about, the breath, meditating, running, exposure to sun, vitamin D is really, really important. Walking in nature, looking at what's around you, and that's mindfulness, to actually pay attention. When I go for walks recently, it's a lovely time to walk because the bluebells are out. To actually notice things like that, swimming, cycling, being aware of your environment, being with nature, really, really important. And lastly, endorphins, our painkillers. What's going to help with that? What releases endorphins? And we've got, laughter exercises, using essential oils, watching funny films that make you laugh, eating things like dark chocolate, actually, endorphin release is there. Exercising is one of the biggest endorphin releases. So making sure that we're doing that with our children and for ourselves. And these are all, I guess, antibiotics or the kind of prevention. The cortisol becoming corrosive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's really good to hear that list of them. And you know what? None of those things cost one penny.
No.
They cost nothing. It takes a little time, a little thought, and I like your idea of the tiny pieces. Watch for tiny pieces of progress. But also for adults and parents, to reward themselves and to reward themselves for perhaps the tiny pieces of progress every day that they are doing. We're all going to have to be really good at our self-care and encouraging ourselves. I'm always saying you put your oxygen mask on first before you can rescue anybody. It's the big thing. Another thing that we were thinking about was encouraging that naming, that literacy, that ability to name things as they are, as a really strong tool for helping children be really well balanced. To be able to take a little time to say, this is what's going on for me, or at least make a good stab at it. We don't always know exactly what's going on for us. I don't, or not all the time, but to at least encourage children to be able to say, just feeling not quite right, or I'm upset, so that we can respond accordingly. So we call that emotional literacy, don't we? We talked about it before, and we know it's just a mainstay of if you get those emotions balanced and understood and brought to mind, as we call it, mentalizing. It's a bit of a fancy name, but bringing things to mind rather than just damping them down or ignoring them or avoiding them. It's about a real invitation to live with the reality of our own mind and our own body.
Yeah, the executive functioning, like we said, that front part of the brain, it develops from stimulation as well, Jo, and it's how do we do that for our children? Children, where are they going to learn how to talk in a way that's emotional? How do we say, I feel, I need, I am? It's when they hear adults around them say, oh, I'm noticing, I'm wondering, oh gosh, look at your face. Are you confused about something? Are you sad? So they start to connect feelings with facial expressions. They get to learn how to read other people too. So they know where they are in the world and start to learn how to be and compare to another person. Now, if we don't do some of that, if we think about that kind of cortisol when we're talking about it goes into this survival mode of fight, flight, freeze, and you've got kids who kind of either just shut down, don't say anything. You've got kids who kind of like, I'm okay, there's nothing wrong, everything's fine. Or you've got kids who are constantly angry but can't make sense of what that anger is about. You know, they're kind of constantly in fight, and then you've got kids who just need to run away from things or freeze. They're just completely in those places of
avoidance, which is sort of like, it's only a temporary solution, isn't it? We need to help our children. We need to help them face reality. So Sheetal, it's just great talking to you and sharing these ideas, and I know that you love communicating with parents and helping them to help their children, and I love that too. And we've got to wrap up our conversation now, regrettably, but I was just thinking it's worth going over the things that we've discussed together. So we've talked about the way that the environment in which we all live is affecting us, and right now it's a COVID environment and we're all affected by that. And we've talked about ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, and these are negative experiences that impact on the mental health of children. We talked about cortisol and the stress hormones that arise when people are under a lot of pressure. And then we've gone on to talk about creating more positive chemical in the mind, like endorphins and oxytocin and serotonin, and ways to do that. And finally, we've mentioned emotional literacy, because we know that's the sort of core of our communication system about ourselves. And in our field, all of these things are moving us towards mental health. I think I would say to parents, don't feel you've got to take that lot on and do it all in one go. And if you make one tiny step forward at a time to have more mindful and peaceful life that's more managed with your children, then you'll be doing great. But I'd like Sheetal to leave us with any final pieces of advice that she's got that she thinks would be helpful.
Well, I think as you were talking, I was reminded by Dan Hughes' term pace. And I was thinking about, what is it that as parents and adults we can do with our children? And it's remaining playful, having acceptance, being curious, being empathic. When we're parenting and within our parenting, it's that PACE acronym, playful, acceptance, curious, empathic stance that we can take. And the more we can do that, and the more we remain in that stance with our children, the better the children have a chance at being able to talk about their distress, to be able to express their distress. The more they do that, the less likely they are to have the long-term impact of trauma and stress. They can kind of find ways of managing that. It's not going to have a longer-term impact on them. It's not going to be disabling and have an impact on their functioning.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're talking about the parental positioning, the parental stance. And I think I hear another podcast coming on, and I can't wait to do that with you. So bye, Sheetal. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Jo. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. We will continue to discuss this and other topics related to child mental health. So make sure you subscribe, and if you have any questions for future episodes, please email me. There is a link in the podcast description.